Thank you, Mr. Chair, and at outset, let me thank the organizers for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity. I think we are truly well over the time limit, and maybe I should just show the first slide and move on to say that thank you all and kind of move on. But I think some of the aspects that I wanted to touch upon in my presentation on the cyber aspects as well as the electronic warfare have been already kind of talked to by the two previous speakers. So I'm going to move past many of the slides very quickly so that we don't delay you. As such, I'm the last speaker on the last panel. It's not a very happy prospect. Everybody is in a sleepy mode and inattentive in a sense. But let me just try and get through some of the important aspects of this militarization of outer space in a sense. So clearly, I think the developments that you see within the outer space today is an extension of the geopolitics, or the terrestrial politics is actually beginning to play out in outer space as well. So outer space has become one more arena of competition that you see on the Earth in a sense. And there are several different contextualizing factors that have gone into modifying the outer space environment, the conditions in which we function, and so on and so forth. Of course, the power balance, both in Asia, but also at the global level, and I think that's an important factor that is that is emphasizing the need for acquiring more hard power capabilities, including in outer space. So there is a budding signs of arms race, including in outer space, that you're beginning to see. And specifically when it comes to space security, you have advanced military space program. I'll try and relate to some of the major developments within Asia. You have advanced military space programs, including counter space capabilities, which also includes the anti-satellite capability. India became the latest country that demonstrated that capability in March this year. But India was only responding to a capability that already existed in the region, and therefore this was more of a deterrence response that India had to do. But anyway, nevertheless, these are beginning to take place in a sense. There are, of course, no weapons in outer space, but my argument is that the bigger challenge comes from the fact that you don't need to necessarily put a weapon in outer space. You can use ground-based assets to target your satellites in outer space. You don't have to. I don't think any sane country would actually put weapon in outer space, but there are other ways of targeting, including through temporary disruptions or long-term damages and so on and so forth. Increasing space debris. Space debris is typically not a space security challenge, but here I would include in the space security challenge because you have intentional act of creating debris through ASATs and other modes of activities, and therefore we also need to look at the space debris as a space security problem. Of course, you have the civil space cooperation, which is a good thing because states collaborate with each other to develop space capabilities, which are absolutely required for social developmental aspects, but there are also growing security requirements that are pushing countries to develop space capabilities. But my own sense is that if there has to be some broad rules, the rules of the road even for space cooperation, because otherwise you could possibly have states diverting some of the civil space capabilities for military space program, or even worse, to develop ballistic missile programs and so on and so forth, how the rocket technology can be modified for ballistic missile programs. And therefore, I think civil space cooperation can also have some broad rules of engagement and how that needs to be done. We have close to 80 active players in space, and not all of them are state players, state-run programs. You have private sector, which is emerging as a big player, but you also have educational institutions and other small and medium-sized enterprises that are beginning to play a major role in outer space. You also have the problem of small satellites, proliferation of small satellites, mini, micro, nano satellites. Why is it a problem? Because you have the problem of detection and monitoring these small satellites, and already you have a crowded outer space, and when there are new small and medium micro satellites coming up, this is going to be a serious problem. Already there is a global trend where countries are actually moving away from large satellite constellation to smaller satellite constellation because it's easier to replace if there has been a damage and so on and so forth. So this trend is likely to crowd the outer space already that is crowded and congested in a sense. I think this is an important concept when you talk about space security. In the absence of successful multilateral efforts, states are going to be forced to rely on deterrence as the mode of response. But deterrence will have cascading effects because one state realized that this is going to be the only way to protect themselves. Other countries will also go down that path, and that, of course, the negative consequence for all of us. It could also lead to increasing suspicions that will make possible cooperation as well as conflict management in the future a lot more challenging in a sense. Strategic stability, again, a linked, related topic in this regard. This is again touched upon by previous speakers, maintenance of certain amount of predictability as well as non-escalatory relations between states. There has to be a common understanding, strategic understanding between the states that an absence of it could make the stability equations a lot more fragile and questionable. This would suggest the need to have some level of confidence in all states that no one would gain a unilateral advantage if a particular country goes down a certain path of deterrence and so on and so forth. But there are clearly signs of countries moving away from militarization to weaponization. Again, these two are very distinct, different concepts, but often people do confuse because militarization is something that has already happened. That is, militaries around the world practically use space assets for a number of passive military applications, something that has come to be accepted by a lot of different countries because whether you use it for intelligence gathering, information gathering, surveillance, and so on and so forth, these have come to be accepted. But at the same time, now countries are moving towards more actual weaponization, and that is a more dangerous trend that we're seeing. So I will just focus on ASATs for instance, anti-satellite capability. Anti-satellites have been around for a very long time. During the Cold War days between the US and USSR, there have been any number of tests. The last test was done by the US sometime in '83, and after that you had a period of no countries conducting this ASAT capability. But in 2007, you did have this moratorium broken by a certain, by China, following which the US did another anti-satellite test in 2008. And then, of course, you had the most recent one by India. But again, these are, again, signs of a budding military weaponization trends that you are beginning to see in a sense. There are other developments such as the co-orbital ASAT weapons, possibility of missile defense interceptors being used as direct ascent ASAT capability. You have the ground-based high-energy lasers that can be used. Again, there are a number of examples when you look at the top three space-faring powers today. Impact of ASATs, I think I would focus on two major instabilities that it would result in. One is the arms race instability. Essentially, the benign environment that prevailed for 2 decades have been broken since 2007, and that's increasingly going through changes. Technological sophistication of new ASATs, again, that could possibly lead to an arms race within the ASAT. That's the first instability that you have in this regard. The second is the crisis instability that can also be a major problem. Use of ASATs or lasers to disrupt communication that could complicate the command and control systems. It could also reduce the possibility of crisis management, crisis control mechanisms. Also, loss of surveillance satellites, again, would have similar impact in the future. All of this would have serious impact on the ability to manage a crisis, which would all suggest that these are possible situations where you are exacerbating this potential for an actual conflict escalation in a sense. Stability challenges, again, it's been very difficult to establish clear linkages between space and strategic stability, but there is a large number of actors. There are no new major technologies within the outer space domain. Most of the technology, even including counter space technologies like electronic warfare, have existed in the past, but new actors are using these technologies and bringing out new salience way of using some of these technologies. Changed circumstances today, you're also seeing the states and other parties willing to and engaging in developing this technology. There has been a greater incentiveness and willingness to kind of develop as well as potentially use this offensive counter space technology, making the situation a lot more challenging. Space weapons, again, I wish we had a simple definition to say what a space weapon is. But again, today, for instance, when you look at it, the whole range of technologies that can be used for peaceful purposes, such as satellite inspection, satellite refueling and repair. These are broadly called the on-orbit satellite servicing, or technologies to clean up space junk, the space debris that has already crowded the outer space. All of this can also be used in offensive fashion, and I think that's the problem. So how do you define a space weapon and so on and so forth? Second, the very fact that space is a dual-use mechanism, a dual-use asset, again, making the add to the complexities. Of course, then you not have just the problem of dual-use assets. Some of the payloads, for instance, today carry mixed payloads, both civilian and weapon payloads and so on and so forth. So again, if somebody is trying to target, then you're going to target a multiple payload, multiple country payload, but also multiple payloads of various functions and so on and so forth. These are just some of the increasing number of space debris as well as the crowded nature of outer space that you see today. This is by every 5 years, you can see how the outer space environment has been changing. This map, in a sense, captures the number of states that have, that are actually a stakeholder in outer space. All the yellow colors essentially are the stakeholders in space. Most countries have something to do with satellites, but there are a few countries, about 10 countries, that have actually launching capabilities. But practically the rest of the world is, in a sense, has something to do with space, so which means all of them will be affected. So why are we talking about this, and what must be done? One, of course, I think there's a growing trends, which is more states, that's going to be the case. Private sector participation, there are going to be multiple pressures to develop space capabilities, not just for security, but also countries in the developing countries, for instance, are looking at social and developmental aspects as the driving point for developing space capabilities. If anybody has to be a relevant player in space, I think one of the first and foremost capabilities that must be developed is the SSA, Space Situational Awareness, because you have to have a fair amount of understanding as to the environment that you're operating in. So better awareness can also, because I think there are three major aspects: tracking of objects in space, which is involved in SSA. Second is this monitoring space weather. And third is the characterization of space objects. And all of this is important because there are both natural hazards, but also there are intentional acts by states. So unless you have an understanding of the environment that you're operating in, you are going to be running into problems. Let me move quickly. And today, you don't have to rely entirely just on states to provide this SSA data. You have, this is, for instance, the University of Texas has developed this Austria graph. This, again, these are live pictures, so you can actually go and click on each one of them and to see which are the satellites that are active, which are inactive, which is the space debris piece, and so on and so forth. Similarly, there's a private sector company, AGI, that develops this, something called the Space Book. Again, live images you can get where you get the data about what is an active satellite and so on and so forth, the orbits they operate in. Counter space capabilities, many of them have been touched upon, both the cyber and cyber as well as the electronic warfare. But I think the problem comes from the fact that the countries are developing a huge number of counter space capabilities, because the more and more some of the players are relying on counter space, that also become a vulnerability. So for instance, China has been investing a great deal to find what is that vulnerability on the US side, because the US side, especially when it comes to operation in the Asia Pacific and so on and so forth, so far, they are extremely reliant on satellite-based applications and so on and so forth. So I think the vulnerabilities, the fact that you are going to be vulnerable, you will develop counter space capabilities to deny the other party and so on and so forth. So this is what is kind of happening. In terms of the categories of counter space weapons, you have the kinetic physical, which include the anti-satellite missiles, co-orbital systems. You have the non-kinetic physical, which create more like temporary damages and a certain amount of interference without having necessarily a physical impact, a contact in a sense. These include the electromagnetic pulses, direct energy weapons, and so on and so forth. You have the electronic warfare systems, weapons essentially that use radio frequency, which was previously detailed by the speaker. Cyber, again, weapons that use software and network to destroy or interfere with your hostile parties' system, satellite operations, and so on and so forth. I'm just going to run through this because this, again, I have listed the top 3 countries that have developed certain capabilities in this regard, all the 4 types of counter space capabilities. Challenges for the future, I think this is a critical aspect of how and why we must protect the outer space in order to essentially maintain safe, secure, and sustainable use of outer space. One, of course, there is no effective governance mechanism today. You have the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, but that does not cover an entire range of threats that we face today. So at the same time, rulemaking has become extremely challenging. One, because of the new number of actors, the number of actors used. Imagine to build consensus among under about 60 countries. That's a Herculean task, and these are all happening at a time when there is power transition. But so the global power changing dynamics also come into play when countries are trying to develop these mechanisms. Recently, you had a couple of global governance mechanisms. Efforts were made. One is the 2 GGs we have had in the recent past. One was the first group of governmental experts. This is a mechanism that happens within the UN. This was the first one was to develop a GG report on TCBMs, that is the transparency and confidence building measures that came out in 2013. They at least managed to find some consensus among the 15 member countries, and they produced a report at the end of the day. But you had a GGE, the group of governmental experts on PAROS, the prevention of arms race in outer space, starting last year, and which ended this summer. And the contention, the room was so heated up that you could not even get the countries, the 25 member countries, to agree upon the text. So essentially, there was no consensus report at the end of the GG on PAROS. So that speaks a lot about the kind of state of affairs when it comes to developing new rules of the road and so on and so forth. So what can be done in the immediate past to immediate future to avoid essentially the space getting damaged and destroyed? There are, like I said, there are no defensive mechanism against ASATs, anti-satellites, nor any arms control measure, or even TCBM's asset. But at the same time, we have to make efforts to develop both TCBMs and of course, the legal instruments. It's not a choice, one or the other, but I think we have to make attempts to develop all of these different mechanisms. Building better redundancy, I think that's a temporary technical measure, better redundancy, hardening of space capabilities, therefore enhancing the security of backups and so on and so forth. These are some immediate ways to kind of technically deal with these issues, but I think you have a longer problem, a larger problem of dealing with in terms of developing. Cross the speed bump regarding global governance, I think it's easier said than done, but I think this is something that countries must make an effort. Some very specific transparency and confidence building measures include, one of the major issues is space traffic management. Given the crowded and congested nature of outer space, you need some simpler, practical, technical measures that need to be put in place. So one of the first ones include the pre-launch notification. So this has been in play because those countries that have signed on to the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation are also required to notify when they do space launches and so on and so forth. Second, there has to be certain standards for small satellite because to ensure better tracking. Because like I said, there is a global trend to move away from big satellite constellation to smaller ones. And if one has to be able to understand the outer space environment, these have to be able to be tracked, and which means that there has to be certain standards set. Right now, you don't have any global standards in this particular regard. Space situational awareness, data exchange is an important aspect. This is relatively a non-controversial area, and I hope more and more states can come together to develop these capabilities. Right now, the US has the largest network of radars and sensors, followed by Russia and then the EU. But meanwhile, India, Japan, China are also developing certain SSA capabilities, and I think more and more countries need to get involved to have a better coverage of the whole outer space in a sense. ASAT test guidelines, intentional orbits, this is another TCBM that has been floated around by the UNIDR, the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. Essentially that says you will, even if you were to do something, you will do an ASAT without creating any debris. That is essentially doing simulation-based ASAT test. Or even if you're going to be doing, it has to be a lower debris, lower altitude debris, and so on and so forth. Third, notification, prior notification to that. So I think there are different ways countries are trying to see what are those specific, what are those small steps that can be taken to protect the outer space. I'm completely out of time, and I'm going to be stopping here, but I'll be happy to hear your thoughts and comments. Thank you.